I was overwhelmed with happiness. My husband and I were moving to one of the most beautiful and prestigious neighborhoods in the city. The magnificent mansions had long been the stuff of my fantasies, but we weren't rich enough to afford such luxuries. But then fortune smiled on us, and my husband's business began to expand rapidly. In a few years, he managed to accumulate considerable capital, and for our next wedding anniversary, Javier decided to surprise me by buying a 2-story mansion with a small garden where fruit trees grew and luxurious flowers bloomed in the beds. The house impressed me with its stunning interiors. Enchanted, I wandered through the rooms, running my hand over the wallpaper patterns, examining antique statuettes and picturesque paintings. I held a notebook, jotting down what was missing from the house and what needed to be eliminated or replaced. I was particularly taken with the bedroom, decorated in shades of cornflower blue. There was a large double bed covered with a bedspread embroidered with silver thread, a dark brown chest of drawers, a large comfortable closet, and a mirror in a beautiful frame. Heavy curtains allowed the room to be comfortably dark, and I imagined how wonderful it would be to relax and sleep there. In contrast, the living room was decorated in all shades of yellow, making it cheerful and very welcoming. However, as I inspected the room, I couldn't help but frown. Something was clearly missing there. The walls were too bare, I decided, and jotted it down in my notebook. I need to find some suitable paintings to complement the interior. Once I'd finished inspecting the house, satisfied with myself, I got in the car and drove home to prepare dinner for my husband. Javier came home late as usual, with a lot on his plate. He happily ate a plate of mushroom risotto and thanked me. "Did you visit the new house today? Was there a lot of work?" he asked. "The rooms and the kitchen are in very good condition," I replied. "I like everything. Honestly, I'm absolutely delighted. There are a few things that need replacing, of course, but they're only minor details. I've made several notes in my notebook. Tomorrow I'm going shopping to buy everything that's missing." Javier hugged me and kissed my cheek. "You're so clever," he said affectionately. I smiled in response. "I think we'll be able to move into our new house next week," I announced solemnly. "Excellent," Javier replied. "I'm really looking forward to it." The next day, I went shopping. I bought hangers, a coffee table, a mirror for the bathroom, new curtains, and then I went to the art gallery. Luck was on my side. There was a sale that week. I walked around the gallery's spacious rooms for a long time, examining the paintings, but nothing appealed to me. Many paintings predominated with sad shades of blue, and I really wanted to preserve and emphasize the feeling of joy and warmth that the living room of our new home evoked. I was about to give up on finding something suitable when suddenly, in the corner of the room, I noticed a small canvas that immediately caught my eye. The painting depicted a young woman. She looked no older than 18, with curly brown hair, a snub nose covered in freckles and a wild fringe. She was sitting on the grass, wearing a light yellow dress with a crown of dandelions on her head. The painting was literally saturated with the atmosphere of a sunny midday, and the love the artist felt for the girl was so palpable in every brushstroke that I couldn't help but feel goosebumps. I took the painting in my hands. Yes, it suited the living room perfectly and seemed to have been tailor-made for our new home. I wonder who the author is, I thought, looking for a signature and noticing the initials EA in the corner of the canvas. They didn't tell me anything. I looked at the price and was surprised. The painting cost practically nothing. How strange, I thought. I knew a bit about painting, having studied art history extensively at university, and I could say with confidence that the creator of the canvas was a master of his craft, not a casual amateur. The painting exuded innate talent, deep knowledge, and years of experience. So why was his creation so cheap? I decided to ask the gallery owner about it, a fragile woman with delicate wrists and almost translucent blue eyes, whose artistic nature and artistic mindset were immediately evident. "Ah, that painting!" exclaimed the owner. "I've been looking at it for a long time too. Isn't it wonderful? Only a true master of the brush can convey the carefreeness and lightness of a beautiful summer's day like this. There's definitely a piece of his soul left in this painting." "I'm impressed too," I admitted. "But why is the price so low? I'd pay a lot more for it." The gallery owner nodded. "You're right," she said. "I was very surprised too. However, this is the price set by the author of the painting himself. She shrugged and gestured with her hand. I nodded in response, still feeling puzzled. I'll take it, I said to the owner and asked, do you give the artist a percentage of the sale? The woman shook her head. They sent me this painting from Europe. Unfortunately, I don't know the author's name and I don't have any contact information for him, so even if I wanted to, I couldn't send him anything. I took the necessary amount from my wallet and handed it to the woman, refusing the package. I thanked the owner and left the gallery, carefully carrying the painting in my hands. I put it in the back seat of my car and drove to my new home. There, I put the canvas on the sofa in the living room and admired it for a while. You'll be a real decoration of this place, I whispered to the painting. Then I occupied myself with other things for a while. Before I left, I took one last look at the canvas, feeling the same joy that had seized me when I saw the young woman in the yellow dress for the first time. I left the house in a good mood. A week later, Javier and I moved into the new house. With a smile, we walked through the transformed rooms and my husband kissed me softly. I told you, you're a genius. You've taken care of everything yourself. Javier complimented and added, it's so cozy and nice here. I feel like I want to live here. We both laughed, and then I took my husband's hand and led him into the living room. There's one thing I haven't managed to do, I confessed, nodding at the painting. It needs to be hung on the wall, but I don't know how to nail it. Javier smiled. You're a real woman, and that's why I love you, he said, and went to the pantry to get tools. Within 15 minutes, the painting was hanging on the wall, and I was absolutely delighted. Let's go to a restaurant and celebrate this event, Javier suggested, but I shook my head. No, let's spend tonight in our new house. I'll cook something delicious if you don't mind waiting a bit. Javier agreed. Dinner was a great success. I always cooked wonderfully. Javier wiped his mouth with a napkin and leaned back in the soft chair. Your food is tastier than any restaurant, my husband complimented. I smiled gratefully. By the way, do you know who our neighbors are? Javier asked suddenly. I shook my head. I got up from the table and started collecting the empty plates. And who are they? Any celebrities? Javier shook his head. Not at all. They're an elderly couple. They live alone in a huge mansion. I think it's twice the size of ours. Nice, polite people. You can tell they're cultured and there's something to talk about with them. I put the plates in the sink and went back to get the glasses. So why don't we invite them to dinner? I suggested. Why not? Javier shrugged. I think it would be quite appropriate and even commendable of us. I'll go there tomorrow and invite them to dinner on Saturday. Excellent, I agreed. And I'll think about the menu. On Saturday evening, when the whole house seemed to be permeated with delicious aromas, the doorbell rang. At the door stood an elderly couple. He, a tall, gray-haired but still attractive man. She, a small, frail woman with a modern haircut. Javier and I greeted the guests with warm handshakes. We're very happy to meet you, said the elderly lady amiably. She had a soft, rather low voice, which created a very pleasant impression. My name is Alona, and this is my husband, Federico. We're very grateful to you for inviting us. Javier introduced me. Dinner is ready, I replied with a polite smile. Please come into the living room. With those words, I moved on, showing the elderly couple the way. Nodding their heads, Alona and Federico followed me. Javier followed close behind. I paused for a moment, pondering where to accommodate the guests, so I didn't immediately realize what had happened. As soon as the guests crossed the threshold of the yellow room, both spouses froze in place. Alona choked in surprise and covered her mouth with her hand. Federico paled. Javier almost bumped into the guests, but stopped in time. Without understanding what had happened, I turned around, about to say something, and then I noticed the confusion on the faces of the elderly. They were both staring at something on the wall. I turned my head and saw that they were staring at the painting of the girl with the dandelion crown. Is something wrong? Javier asked. That painting, Alona whispered softly. And what's wrong with it? I asked in surprise. Alona swallowed nervously, without saying a word. I know that girl, the woman finally said. We both know her, added Federico. Both spouses' gazes clouded over, as if they were mentally traveling to a very distant place. "Eduardo, are you ready?" Alona shouted from downstairs. She had already thrown a thin cardigan over her shoulders and was impatiently tapping her index finger on the banister of the stairs leading to the second floor, where their only son, Eduardo's room, was. "Yes, Mom, I'm coming down," he replied hastily, stuffing a pile of notebooks and a pencil case into his backpack. "Just a minute." "Hurry up, it's only 30 minutes to school and there will probably be traffic on the road," Alona reminded him. Eduardo attended a prestigious business school. His parents wanted him to follow in the footsteps of his father, who was a successful businessman. Eduardo, to be honest, didn't think much about the future. He was only 14 and his life consisted of friends, soccer, trips to the countryside, and camping in the mountains. That day was as ordinary as it could be. The boy came home from school on the school bus, had a quick snack, and went to kick a ball around in the old stadium, which was a few blocks from his house. He met his friends there almost every day. This place was different from the upscale neighborhood where Eduardo lived, so he never told his parents he went there. The abandoned stadium was in the heart of the old town, surrounded by a maze of narrow streets where rather poor families lived. They hung their clothes in the street and their children played with stones in the dust on the sidewalk. Eduardo liked having his own secret life, which his parents didn't know about. It made him feel grown up in his own eyes. Some of the friends he played soccer with were from school. Others were locals. Eduardo never behaved arrogantly towards them. In the game, everyone was equal. From the poor kids, Eduardo learned and even picked up many inappropriate words. He thought it was cool to talk like that, but of course he carefully filtered his speech in front of his parents. Eduardo and his friends were lazily kicking a ball around when suddenly they heard barking and squealing. Attracted by the sounds, the boys ran to see what was going on. Turning the corner of the neighboring building, they found themselves in a small alley where they saw the following scene. Several large mongrel dogs, growling menacingly, surrounded a small orange and white dog. Nearby, a little girl was trying to chase the dogs away with a stick. Eduardo took a quick look at the girl. Curly brown hair, brown eyes, clearly masculine clothes that didn't fit her, probably inherited from an older brother, I thought, and looked away. I didn't suspect at the time that this encounter would change my whole life. "Hey, Marissa, what's going on here?" shouted one of the poor kids. "They attacked Pedro," replied the girl, almost crying. "Wait, don't get involved. We'll scare them off by ourselves," said the boy. He took the stick from her and advanced fearlessly towards the dogs. It was clear that he wasn't used to facing difficulties head-on. Eduardo was even involuntarily impressed by him. The dogs growled, but sensing the fearlessness emanating from the boy, they tucked their tails and backed off. The other boys scared them off with loud shouts and applause. "There, that's it," said the boy happily, throwing away the stick and bending down to stroke the little orange and white dog behind the ear. "Pedro, you have nothing more to fear." Then he stood up and smiled at Marissa. "And you'd better not try to deal with them on your own again," he said sternly. "Call us immediately, we're always around at the stadium." Marissa nodded. "Who's that?" I asked as the girl and Pedro left. "A neighbor," the boy replied. "I've known her since we were babies." I nodded and immediately forgot about the girl and her dog. But Marissa and Pedro started coming to the stadium frequently. The girl would sit in the old, half-rotten stands and watch the game intently. For some reason unknown to me, I began to look forward to her appearance more and more. I constantly looked in Marissa's direction and missed passes. "Hey, stop daydreaming!" Someone shouted at me. I bit my lip and promised myself not to look in the girl's direction anymore. The next day, as if she'd heard my words, she didn't come. I felt disappointed and annoyed. When I got home, I sat down at my desk and started scribbling silly drawings in my notebook. Then I managed to draw a face with big eyes and saw Marissa in it. I tore the scribbled sheet out of the notebook, tore it up, and threw myself on the bed. The next day, I was at the stadium again, wondering if Marissa was coming. It was overcast that day. The clouds hung low over the city, warning that the rain could start at any moment. Maybe that's why the stadium was unusually empty. I was kicking the old worn-out ball by myself, which nobody ever took home, when suddenly I heard a dog barking and turned around. There she was. She had come. I didn't understand why my face broke into a silly but happy smile. I quickly put on a serious expression and started playing soccer with determination. Marissa sat in the stands and kept her eyes on me, occasionally glancing at Pedro, who was running around the field like a madman. Finally, I ran out of energy and approached the stands to get a bottle of water from my backpack. Involuntarily, I looked at the girl. Today, she was wearing baggy dark jeans and a large red and white t-shirt with the image of a bull on it. I briefly met the girl's big brown eyes and quickly looked away. "Are you afraid of me?" I heard her ask. "Where did you get that idea?" I protested. "I just feel it," the girl said simply. I forced myself to look at her. She stared at me intensely. "You're one of the rich ones, aren't you?" Marissa said, squinting. For some reason, I felt embarrassed, as if being rich was a bad thing. "Not really," I mumbled. "Do you have a big, beautiful house?" she asked. I nodded. "And a car?" the girl continued. "Yes, my parents do," I replied. "So you're rich," Marissa concluded. I shrugged. "Does it matter?" "It matters. I'd like to become rich," she admitted. "So what?" I asked. "I could do whatever I want," Marissa admitted, "and help others." I pondered. Do I always do what I want? I go to school because I have to. I play soccer because all my friends do. Marissa looked at me intensely with her deep, dark eyes, and I felt strange, as if I had just woken up and couldn't remember where I was. "What are you thinking?" the girl asked. I shrugged. I didn't know how to put into words what I was feeling. A drop of rain suddenly fell on my forehead. I looked worriedly up at the sky. "It looks like it's going to rain soon, or maybe even storm," Marissa replied nonchalantly. The second drop hit my hand. "We need to get out of here," I said seriously, pulling my hood over my head. "Are you coming?" Marissa jumped down from the stands and called Peter. The rain intensified every moment. By the time we reached the exit of the stadium, it had turned into a downpour. I looked around for shelter when I felt Marissa grab my hand. "This way," she shouted abruptly. "Let's run." I followed the girl. She led me confidently down a winding alley. We took shelter under the arch of one of the old buildings and caught our breath. The downpour formed a wall, separating us from the rest of the world. "Nice place," I commented. "The main thing is that it's dry," Marissa added, and we both laughed. The girl was very close and I could feel her breath on my face. I wanted to move away, afraid that Marissa would hear how loudly my heart was beating, but there was no room. I took a deep breath and smelled her hair, which had something of the forest and wild grass about it, as well as the scent of mint and cherry blossoms. I closed my eyes for a moment and my imagination took me far away. "A poor old artist lives here," I heard Marissa's voice and opened my eyes. "Right in this building in the basement." "Really?" I asked, surprised. I thought artists always lived in big, bright studios where there was lots of light and space, and where all the walls were adorned with picturesque canvases. Marissa nodded. "Do you want to visit him? I've known him for years. Sometimes he offers me sweets and other children too, but usually he's very busy. He paints all day." "Wow," was all I managed to say. "To tell you the truth, hardly anyone buys his paintings," Marissa added with sadness in her voice. The rain eased off a little, drumming lightly in the puddles that now adorned the worn sidewalk. "Come on," said Marissa, taking my hand again. She led me through the building to a tiny entrance. After climbing a few high steps, we descended into the basement and found ourselves in front of a door painted dark green. Marissa grabbed the handle and pulled the door towards her. It was unlocked. "It never locks," Marissa explained as she went in first. I followed her inside. Instantly, strong smells of oil paints and solvents invaded my nostrils. I closed my eyes and coughed. I wanted to go out and breathe the fresh air after the rain, but when I opened my eyes, I saw a magical world. The spacious room was filled with canvases and large paintings depicting fairy tales. Fairies and elves, dwarves and dragons, princesses and mermaids, monsters and giants lived on the canvases. The impression of the paintings was intensified by the fact that the basement room was lit by a single-floor lamp without a lampshade. In the dim light, everything seemed fantastic, as if Marissa had taken me through an invisible portal to a parallel universe. I had never felt anything like it before. In the center of the room, there was an easel, behind which stood an old, bent man. He didn't turn around when he heard our footsteps. Apparently, the artist was either deaf or deeply immersed in the creative process. Mr. Emiliano, Marissa called out, approaching and lightly touching his shoulder. The artist startled and finally turned around. "Ah, Miss Marissa," he replied grandly. "I'm pleased to welcome you to my humble abode. And this is your young friend?" "Yes," the girl nodded. "His name is Eduardo." The old man stood up and held out a dry, wrinkled hand, stained with paint. The artist's shirt and pants were also covered in colored stains, as if he were an invisible rainbow creature. "Don't worry, the paint has dried," said old Emiliano with a complicit smile. I shook his hand confidently. Mr. Emiliano looked at me intently. "So you want to become an artist too?" he asked suddenly. It was so unexpected that I didn't have an answer. "No," Marissa answered for me. "He's from a wealthy family. He'll probably be a company director, right?" With those words, Marissa looked at me sidelong. For some reason, I blushed. "Well, yes, my father wants me to stay in his business," I replied. "But I immediately noticed the nature of an artist in you," he said thoughtfully, squinting his eyes and then turning to Marissa. "Look at your long fingers." Marissa took my hand. "Indeed, Mr. Emiliano, they are so long." She nodded and laughed. "And I thought he only knew how to kick a ball." I quickly hid my hand in my pocket, but Marissa caught the gesture. "Don't worry so much," she reassured me. "Mr. Emiliano is only joking. He sees art in everything." I nodded. "Your paintings are beautiful," she said. We spent some more time with the artist before heading home. Marissa had to prepare dinner for the whole family. Her mother had recently given birth. As I walked home through the winding streets, the dimly lit room and the old artist's magical paintings lingered in my mind. I was impressed. When I got home, my parents weren't there. I found a note on the fridge. "I'm visiting a friend. Dad is working and will be home late. Dinner is in the fridge. Kisses." The meticulous lines written by my mother's hand read, "I didn't bother to heat up dinner." I took some cookies from the basket on the table and went upstairs. In my room, I lay on the bed and wondered, was the old artist telling the truth? Suddenly, I felt a strong urge to pick up a pencil. I got up, sat down at the table, and took a notebook out of the drawer. I remembered the silly scribbles and smiled. I drew a few hesitant lines. Then my hand steadied itself, and after a few minutes, Marissa appeared on the sheet of paper, almost alive. I thought for a moment and drew fairy wings behind her. "I'll show the drawing to Mr. Emiliano tomorrow," I decided. The next day, instead of going to the soccer field, I went to the artist's studio. On the way, I felt uncertain. What if my drawing was silly and untalented? But I immediately remembered Mr. Emiliano's words, which gave me strength. In the studio, everything was as it had been the day before. The same magical atmosphere, the same soft light, and the smell of paint. The old artist was once again so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear anything around him. I walked over and touched his shoulder. "Ah, it's you, my boy. Hello, Mr. Emiliano," I said nervously. "I wanted to show you something." I took the folded drawing of Marissa out of my pocket and handed it to the old man. Mr. Emiliano squinted his eyes and carefully examined the lines. His hand, holding the paper, trembled slightly. I waited patiently, but Mr. Emiliano didn't speak for a long time. Just as I was about to think that something was wrong with the drawing, the old man finally spoke. "Very precise lines, and what a likeness." "I recognized little Marissa immediately," he said. I smiled. The compliment was gratifying for me. "But that's not the main thing," added the artist. "In your drawing, there is a soul and a flight, and also love." With those words, the old man looked away from the drawing and into my eyes. I was embarrassed. I don't know how it happened." The old man smiled cunningly. "Wonderful," he said. "If you like, stay and draw with me." I almost jumped with surprise. "Really? May I?" "Why not?" replied old Emiliano. "There are clean canvases, paints, and brushes. Take them and draw whatever your soul desires." I nodded. I didn't know what would come of it, but I really wanted to try. From then on, I started going to Mr. Emiliano's studio almost every day. I brought new canvases and paints, which I bought with my pocket money because I realized that all this was very expensive and the old man couldn't afford it. Mr. Emiliano grew fond of me. He liked to pass on his knowledge to me, and I was also an excellent student. I knew how to listen, and most importantly, I learned very quickly. He has a gift from nature, thought the old man. You can't just bury it in the ground and forget about it. This talent must bring benefits and joy to people. Marissa also visited Mr. Emiliano's studio frequently to see how things were progressing. Sometimes she posed for me. The girl and I became friends, but Marissa was more than just a friend to me. I often walked her home, and that day was no exception. On the way, we talked about dreams and plans. As we approached Marissa's house, I felt my heart beating even faster. I realized that this was the moment I had been waiting for. When we pulled up in front of her house, I turned to her and looked directly into her eyes. I saw the sparkle and warmth in them that melted away my fears. "Are we meeting tomorrow?" I asked, feeling my voice tremble with excitement. Marissa smiled back. "Yes, we'll meet in the studio, just like today," she replied, her voice soft and confident. I approached her as if drawn by a magnet. I could feel her warmth and her breath on my face. I leaned in and kissed her softly on the lips. That first kiss was like magic for both of us. It was a moment of complete transparency when we opened our hearts to each other. In that kiss were embedded our dreams, hopes, and feelings that we held inside. After the kiss, Marissa lowered her head shyly. "Is something wrong?" I asked, worried. "Everything's fine," Marissa replied softly. "It's just that you're rich after all," she said. "Your parents would never allow you to associate with me." I hugged her and whispered, "They'll have to accept it." Several years passed. Marissa and I continued to meet secretly, and I went to Mr. Saro Emiliano's studio several times a week to paint. The final exams were approaching, followed by admission to the business school my father had chosen for me. Actually, admission was just a formality. My father knew the principal and all the teachers well and had already arranged for me to study there. However, I myself had long doubted whether I really wanted to follow in my father's footsteps. The path of an artist attracted me and wouldn't let me go. At night, I dreamt of unpainted paintings and often jumped out of bed to quickly sketch what I had seen in my dreams. I was obsessed with painting, shapes, colors, textures, and everything related to it. Marissa always supported me. Our relationship was smooth, but the fact that my parents still didn't know about us worried her. "You need to tell them everything," Marissa often said. I just nodded in response, but couldn't bring myself to take any action. Then came the hot exam season, which I passed with excellent marks. My parents were delighted and suggested we celebrate the end of school in a restaurant. I agreed, but said I wouldn't go alone. "Do you have a girlfriend, son? And for how long?" my mother exclaimed in surprise. I nodded. "For quite a while." My mother clapped her hands. "Why didn't you introduce us? I really want to meet her." I picked Marissa up at exactly 7 o'clock. In honor of graduation, my father had given me a new car. Marissa was waiting for me on the porch of her house, wearing a simple but very pretty pink dress, and had tried to tame her untamed hair into a beautiful updo. "I didn't wear high heels," said Marissa when I got out of the car. "Firstly, I don't know how to walk in them, and secondly, I don't own any." I smiled. "You look beautiful even without heels," I said sincerely, and kissed her. Then I turned to the car and casually asked, "By the way, what do you think of my car?" "It'll do," said Marissa mischievously, and we laughed together. We arrived at the restaurant right on time. I was very nervous, and Marissa was even more so. I could feel her hand trembling in my big palm. I squeezed her tighter, as if to say that everything would be all right. However, things didn't go well. Seeing Marissa's cheap dress and jewelry, my mother frowned. Federico also remained rather cold. Ilona asked Marissa what she was doing and which college she intended to attend. Marissa shook her head, admitting that her family couldn't afford it. After those words, the coldness at the table became almost palpable. When everyone had finished dinner, Marissa said she had a slight headache, and I took her home. We were silent almost the whole way. "They just need some time," I said hopefully. Marissa nodded silently, although deep down she knew it was just an illusion. Eduardo's rich, snobbish parents would never accept her. At home, my mother scolded me sharply. "How could you get involved with a poor girl?" she shouted. "She's not your equal." Federico remained silent, but his demeanor clearly indicated that he agreed with my mother. "You just don't know her," I exclaimed angrily. "Marissa is wonderful, sweet, funny, and real. You're too obsessed with money and status to see the essence, and I don't care about her social status. I love her." With those words, I went upstairs and slammed the bedroom door. Sighing deeply, my mother sank into a chair and covered her face with her hands. "What did we do to deserve this?" she murmured softly. Federico approached her, hugging her and stroking her hair affectionately. "Don't worry, darling," he said gently. "Soon, Eduardo will go to college and you'll forget about that poor girl. Remember my words." But it wasn't to be. The day before I left, I disappeared. Ilona and Federico were beside themselves with worry and fear. They called the police and said they suspected I had run away with a poor girl called Marissa. The police started a search, but I was never found. A few days later, Ilona and Federico found a plain white envelope on the front door containing a note. "Dear Mom and Dad, forgive me," I wrote, "but I can't do it any other way. I don't want to separate from Marissa, whom I love very much, and I don't want to go to business school. My vocation is different. I'm going to be an artist and I hope to become world famous. When you find this note and read these lines, Marissa and I will be strolling through the fall of Paris. Sorry again. Your son, Eduardo." My mother dropped the note from her hands and began to cry. Federico hugged her tightly and didn't let go until she calmed down. Since then, they never saw me again and never heard from me again. They didn't even know if I was still alive. "What a sad story," said Letitia, handing Ilona a handkerchief. The old woman wiped away her tears. "Now you understand our state when we saw your painting. It depicts Marissa, that same poor girl we saw only once in the restaurant, but who is impossible to forget." "There's something sincere," I intervened. "Genuine." Ilona nodded. "You're right," she replied thoughtfully, her gaze fixed on the canvas. "That painting exudes a very strong love." I looked again at the girl on the canvas. "I feel it too." Ilona took my hand enthusiastically. "I'm sure that the artist of this painting is my son." I remembered the signature left by the artist in the corner of the canvas. "E.A., I thought. Are those his initials?" Federico, who had been silent until that moment, suddenly leaned forward. "Eduardo Allende. Yes, that's him," he exclaimed with burning eyes. "El, please tell us where you bought that painting. Maybe we can trace our son's whereabouts." "In a gallery in the city center," I replied. "It was very cheap. I wanted to pay a bit more to thank the artist, but the owner said the painting was sent from Europe. Maybe it's still there," Ilona said, putting her hands together in prayer. Federico stood up and began pacing back and forth, as if contemplating something. "Please give us the address of this gallery. We'll go there tomorrow and talk to the owner ourselves." I nodded enthusiastically. "Sure, no problem. I hope you can find it." Ilona and Federico sat on the plane that was taking them to the French capital. In the old man's wallet was the address of the Parisian art gallery where their son's painting came from. "We'll find it, I promise," Federico assured his wife, who nodded confidently. Hope now lived in his heart. Paris welcomed them with rain. Arriving at the hotel by cab, Federico and Ilona wasted no time, and despite being terribly tired after the flight, changed their clothes and immediately went to the address written on the piece of paper. The gallery owner, a dark-haired middle-aged man with round glasses and a suit, welcomed them warmly. "We've come a long way with a very delicate matter," Federico confessed. "We're looking for our son," declared Ilona simply. "He's an artist. His name is Eduardo Allende," added Federico. "Does that name sound familiar?" The gallery owner frowned. It was clear that he didn't know how to proceed. After a brief hesitation, he firmly affirmed that the name was not familiar to him. But how can that be? Federico couldn't believe it. He stared at the man, realizing that he was probably lying, but there was nothing he could do. The couple had to leave on their own. However, at the door, Ilona turned once more and said softly, "If you happen to remember him, please tell him that his parents really want to see him." We're really sorry we didn't support you back then. Federico nodded enthusiastically. And please tell Eduardo that we're staying at the Four Seasons Hotel. The gallery owner gave a brief nod, avoiding eye contact. The elderly couple left the gallery feeling dejected and sad. The next day, they decided to walk around the city. When they returned to the hotel, they saw Eduardo in the large lobby. Alona and Federico were speechless. The young man ran his hand through his beard and looked much older than the last time they had seen him. His worn appearance and tattered clothes shocked them. Tears welled up in Alona's eyes, and she couldn't help wondering why Eduardo hadn't been thrown out of such a luxurious hotel. "Son," she exclaimed, running towards him. He looked at her a little distantly, but Alona didn't mind and hugged him tightly. "Eduardo, we miss you so much." Federico approached and patted his son on the shoulder. Eduardo tensed up, but the more his mother held him, the more he relaxed in her embrace. "Mom," he finally whispered, "have you really forgiven me?" "Of course, son," she assured him. "We're the ones who have to ask for forgiveness. We acted like real snobs. Now I understand how important this girl was to you. I saw your painting, the one with her wearing a dandelion crown." "Really?" Eduardo looked surprised. Alona finally released him from her embrace. "Yes, and it's beautiful. That painting helped us find you. But why did you sell it so cheap?" Eduardo lowered his head. "There's a lot I need to tell you." "Then let's go to a nearby restaurant," suggested Eduardo's father, but he shook his head. "Aren't you ashamed of my clothes? You've never put up with poverty," he said softly. "Forgive us, son," said my mother. "We don't care what you're wearing." "That's true," my father added sincerely. "We've come to understand a lot of things over the years," my mother admitted. We headed to a restaurant where we settled down at a table and were given menus. However, neither of us touched the food. It had been too long since we'd seen each other to think about food. "In fact, I've become an artist," I began to tell my story. "And a very good artist," sighed my mother. "I was invited to various events. My paintings were constantly shown at exhibitions. I was making decent money. Marissa and I were planning a grand wedding, but..." My voice faltered and I turned pale. My mother anxiously held my hand. "What happened?" she asked. "Marissa got sick," I replied softly. "All the money I earned went towards her treatment." My mother couldn't take her worried eyes off me. "So?" she asked, dreading the answer. "It didn't help," I admitted. "Marissa keeps getting weaker every day. She needs surgery and we need a lot of money. So I sold everything we had and started selling my paintings for low prices." I lowered my head, the tears starting to flow. "I love her so much, but I can't help her. We don't have enough money." My father, pale, put his cold hand over mine and my mother's. "How much is needed?" he asked firmly. "I'll cover everything." I raised my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. "Is that true?" I asked softly. "Of course," my father nodded. "We are a family after all." "Marissa will get better," my mother said. "We'll all dance at your wedding and then take care of the grandchildren. And you'll paint a portrait of me and your father." I smiled, thanking her. Letitia listened to Alona's fragmented narrative with surprise and joy. "I'm so happy that you found your son," she said over the phone. "But now you need to rest. You've been through a lot. Sleep is the best solution right now." After saying goodbye to Alona, Letitia was pensive, looking out of the window for a few moments. Javier came in, carrying shopping bags. Kissing his wife, he noticed that she was in a strange state of mind. "Is everything all right?" he asked, putting the bags on the table. "Alona called," I replied. I approached my husband and began to help him unpack the shopping. "And how are things? Have they found their son?" asked Javier, opening a bag of spicy cookies. "Imagine that, yes." I nodded happily. "All's well that ends well." "All's well that ends well," philosophized Javier, kissing me on the cheek, and then going into the living room to watch TV. I finished unpacking the shopping and joined him, taking a seat on the sofa next to my beloved husband. I looked at the young woman in the painting. "I hope you get better soon," I wished silently.